bowl of hot soup slipped from Lyra's hands and shattered against the stone floor. At the exact moment the doors of the great hall swung open. Every head turned, every voice stopped, and there she was, kneeling in a puddle of broth and broken pottery, staring up at the man who had just walked into the room like a storm, walking on two legs. She knew who he was before anyone said his name. Nobody in the 12 packs needed an introduction to Cade Direwolf. His presence alone pressed down on the room, like a hand closing around every throat at once. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a winter sky right before snow, he moved like a man who had never once in his life been told no. Lyra's hands trembled as she reached for the broken pieces of the bowl. She could feel the eyes of the entire Blackthorn pack burning into her back. This was supposed to be her easiest task all evening. Carry the soup, do not spill it, do not be seen. She had failed at all three, within the first 10 seconds of the summit feast. Clean this up before the Alpha King thinks we can't even feed our own guests, hissed Greta, the pack's head of house staff, yanking Lyra up by the arm hard enough to leave a mark. You clumsy, useless girl. Lyra did not answer. She never answered. 18 years in the Blackthorn pack had taught her that silence was safer than words, and stillness was safer than motion. She had grown up being told she was cursed, unwanted, an omega too weak to matter, a girl with no parents, and no place, and no worth. She believed most of it by now. It was easier than fighting it. She bent down to gather the shattered pottery, moving quickly, hoping the moment would pass unnoticed, the way every humiliating moment in her life eventually did. But it did not pass. A shadow fell across her hands. Cade Direwolf had crossed the entire hall in the time it took her to pick up 3 broken shards, and now he stood directly above her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the chill of the stone floor beneath her knees. Leave it, he said. His voice was low, quiet, and yet it filled the room the way thunder fills a valley. Lyra froze. Around her, she heard the sharp intake of breath from a dozen Blackthorn wolves. Nobody spoke to the Alpha King, unless spoken to first. Nobody made him wait, and yet here he was, waiting on her, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle in a way she had never felt before. My lord, I am terribly sorry, Greta said quickly, stepping forward with her head bowed low. The girl is careless. She will be punished for her clumsiness after the feast, I assure you. I did not ask about punishment, Cade said, without even glancing at her. His eyes stayed fixed on Lyra. I asked her a question. Look at me. Lyra's heart pounded so hard, she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. Slowly, she lifted her chin and met his gaze. His eyes narrowed, just slightly, the way a hunter's eyes narrow when they catch a scent they cannot quite place. Something shifted in his expression. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. All 3 passed across his face, in the span of a single breath. What is your name? He asked. Lyra, she whispered. Lyra Ashworth, my lord. He said nothing for a long moment. He simply stared at her, the way a man stares at something impossible, something his mind refuses to accept, even as his eyes insist it is real. Then, without another word, he reached down and helped her to her feet. The entire hall gasped. An Alpha King did not touch a servant girl. He did not help her rise. He did not look at her as though she were the only person in the room worth seeing. Get her water, Cade said sharply to no one in particular. And someone bring a cloth. My lord, there is no need, Lyra stammered, mortified beyond words. I am only a servant. I do not require. I did not ask what you require, Cade said, his tone gentler now, though his eyes had not softened. I gave an order. The Blackthorn Alpha, a broad and cruel man named Harwin, rose from his seat at the head table, his face flushed with confusion and irritation. Cade, forgive the interruption. The girl is nothing, truly, an orphan we took in out of pity. She has no bloodline, no rank, nothing worth your attention. Please, return to your seat and let us continue the feast in your honor. Cade turned toward him slowly, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. Nothing worth my attention, he repeated. Tell me, Harwin, if she is nothing, why does the air around her carry a scent I have not smelled in 20 years? The hall fell utterly silent. Even the crackling fire in the great hearth seemed to hold its breath. Harwin's smile faltered. I do not understand, my lord. Neither do I, Cade said quietly, still watching Lyra, as though she were a puzzle missing half its pieces. Not yet. Lyra did not understand what was happening either. She had spent her entire life invisible, a girl nobody wanted, tucked into the lowest corners of pack life, fed on scraps of kindness and mountains of insult. She had learned to expect nothing, to want nothing, because wanting only led to disappointment. And now the most powerful wolf in the 12 packs was staring at her, as though she held some secret even she did not know she carried. "Finish your duties," Cade said finally, releasing whatever thought had gripped him, though his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. "We will speak again before I leave Blackthorn territory." He turned and walked back toward the head table, and the hall exhaled as one collective breath. Conversation resumed, though quieter now, filled with whispers and sideways glances thrown in Lyra's direction. She stood frozen for a moment longer, feeling the ghost of his hand still warm against hers, feeling the weight of dozens of curious stares. Greta grabbed her arm the moment Cade was out of earshot. "What did you do?" she snapped, dragging Lyra toward the kitchen door. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing," Lyra said honestly. "I said nothing at all." "Do not embarrass this pack again tonight," Greta warned, shoving her through the kitchen doorway. "Stay back here, where you belong. If the Alpha King asks for you again, tell him you are needed elsewhere." Lyra nodded, though her mind was still spinning. She busied herself with the evening's remaining tasks, scrubbing pots, carrying trays, keeping her head down, exactly as she had been trained to do since she was old enough to walk. But she could not stop replaying the moment in her mind. The way his eyes had changed, the way his voice had dropped when he mentioned a scent from 20 years ago, the way he had looked at her not with pity, and not with disgust, but with something closer to shock. Nobody had ever looked at her that way before. Later that night, long after the feast had ended and the visiting packs had retired to their guest quarters, Lyra slipped outside to empty the last of the wash water into the garden drain. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. She breathed it in deeply, grateful for a few stolen minutes of quiet before Greta noticed her absence and called her back inside. She did not hear him approach. Wolves as powerful as Cade Direwolf did not need to make noise when they moved. "You are hiding something," he said, from the shadows near the garden wall. Lyra spun around, nearly dropping the wash basin. "My lord, I did not see you there." "That was rather the point," Cade said, stepping into the pale moonlight. Up close, without the noise and pressure of the feast hall around them, he seemed less like a terrifying king, and more like a man carrying an enormous weight on his shoulders. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Of course," Lyra said, though her pulse was racing. "Where were you born?" Lyra blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I do not know, my lord. I was found as an infant, left at the edge of Blackthorn territory. The pack took me in, though they never let me forget that I was not truly one of them." Something flickered across Cade's face, quick and sharp, like pain trying to hide itself. "Found. Left at the edge of the territory. Do you know how old you were?" "A few months, perhaps. I do not know the exact details. Harwin's family has never spoken of it kindly." Cade was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes distant, as though he were looking through her and into some memory only he could see. 20 years ago, he said finally, almost to himself, an entire bloodline vanished in a single night. Every wolf who carried it was believed lost, but your scent, Lyra Ashworth, carries an echo of that bloodline so strong, I nearly mistook you for someone I once knew. Lyra's throat went dry. "I do not understand what that means." "Neither do I. Not fully," Cade admitted. "But I intend to find out, and until I do, you are not to leave Blackthorn territory, and you are not to be harmed. Do you understand me?" "My lord, I am only a servant. Harwin will not listen to such a request without explanation." "He will listen," Cade said, and for the first time that night, something dangerous flashed behind his eyes, "because I will make certain of it." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at her one final time. "Get some rest, Lyra. Tomorrow may change everything you believe about who you are." She stood alone in the cold garden long after he disappeared into the darkness, clutching the empty wash basin to her chest, her mind racing with questions she could not begin to answer. For 18 years she had been told she was worthless, a burden, a nameless girl with no history and no future. But the Alpha King of the 12 packs had just looked at her as though she carried something precious enough to change the fate of every pack in the land. She did not know whether to feel hope or fear. Perhaps, she realized as she finally turned back toward the kitchen door, she should feel both. Inside, the kitchen was dark, except for a single candle burning near the wash basin. Lyra set down her bucket and pressed her palms flat against the cold stone counter, trying to steady her breathing. Her whole body still trembled from the encounter in the garden, from the weight of his eyes, from the strange, gentle authority in his voice when he had told her to rest. A creak on the stairs made her spin around. It was old Mabel, the kitchen cook, a stooped woman with kind eyes, who had been the only person in the entire pack to ever show Lyra a shred of real warmth. Mabel had fed her extra bread on hungry nights and hummed old lullabies, while Lyra scrubbed pots, never asking questions, never demanding gratitude. "You are still awake, child," Mabel said softly, shuffling into the kitchen in her worn slippers. "I saw him through the window. The Alpha King, speaking with you in the garden." Lyra's cheeks flushed. "You saw that?" "I see many things this pack would rather I did not," Mabel said, lowering herself onto a wooden stool with a tired sigh. "What did he want with you?" "I do not fully understand it myself," Lyra admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. "He asked about my birth, about where I was found. He said something about a bloodline that vanished 20 years ago, and that I carry its scent." Mabel went very still. Mabel went very still. The candlelight flickered across her weathered face, and for a moment, something like fear passed through her eyes before she carefully smoothed it away. "Mabel, do you know something?" "I know that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again," Mabel said carefully. "I know that Harwin has always kept secrets buried deeper than any of us can see. And I know that the night you were found at the edge of our territory, it was not a quiet night. There were rumors, whispers among the older wolves, talk of smoke on the northern horizon, and a silence that fell over the forest for 3 full days afterward." Lyra's heart began to pound. What kind of smoke? What happened 3 days before I was found? Mabel shook her head slowly. "I was young myself then, only a junior kitchen hand. I do not know the full truth, only fragments passed between frightened voices long ago. But if the Alpha King himself is asking questions about you, child, then perhaps it is time those fragments were pieced together at last." "Harwin will never allow it," Lyra said bitterly. "He has spent 18 years reminding me that I am nothing. If there is a truth buried somewhere, he will bury it deeper before he lets me find it." "Then you will need help finding it before he does," Mabel said, reaching out to squeeze Lyra's hand, with surprising strength for such an old, frail woman. "The Alpha King has already noticed you. That alone will change everything, whether Harwin wishes it or not. Powerful men do not forget a scent that troubles them. He will return. Be ready when he does." Lyra swallowed hard, staring down at the old woman's weathered hand covering her own. For the first time in her entire life, she felt something stir inside her chest that was not fear, not shame, and not the dull ache of being unwanted. It was something far more dangerous. It was hope. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Cade's face, in the moment their gazes had first locked across the great hall, the flicker of shock and recognition that had passed behind his winter-colored eyes. She thought of the word he had used, bloodline. She thought of smoke on a northern horizon, and 3 days of silence swallowing an entire forest. She thought of 18 years of being told she was worthless, and wondered, for the first time, if perhaps everyone around her had been wrong. By the time dawn broke over Blackthorn territory, painting the sky in pale gold and rose, Lyra rose from her narrow cot with a strange new resolve settling over her like armor. Whatever truth was buried in her past, whatever secret Harwin had spent 18 years hiding, she intended to uncover it. And somewhere across the pack grounds, preparing to depart with the rest of the visiting alphas, Cade Direwolf was thinking the very same thing. Neither of them yet understood how deeply their fates had already become entangled, nor how quickly the quiet lie that had shaped Lyra's entire existence was about to unravel in front of every pack in the land. Cade did not leave with the rest of the visiting alphas that morning. Instead, he sent his convoy ahead, under the command of his second, a sharp-eyed wolf named Corwin, while he remained behind at Blackthorn territory, under the excuse of inspecting the northern boundary line. Harwin, though clearly unsettled by the sudden change of plans, could do nothing but agree. One did not question the Alpha King's decisions, no matter how strange they seemed. Lyra learned of his decision to stay through kitchen gossip before the sun had fully risen. The other servants whispered about it over the morning porridge, wondering aloud why the most powerful wolf in the 12 packs would delay his return home for a territory as unremarkable as Blackthorn. Nobody dared guess the true reason, though Lyra felt it settle in her stomach like a stone the moment she heard the news. He was staying because of her. She tried to focus on her chores, scrubbing the breakfast dishes with more force than necessary, sweeping the hallway floors until her arms ached. Anything to keep her mind from spinning back to the garden, to his voice, to the word that had haunted her sleep. Bloodline. But focus proved impossible. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing toward the window, watching for a tall figure moving across the training yard, half expecting him to appear again without warning, the way he had the night before. By mid-morning, Harwin summoned her to his study, a request so unusual that Greta nearly dropped the tray she was carrying when she delivered the message. Servants were never summoned to Harwin's study unless they had done something to earn severe punishment. Lyra's stomach twisted with dread as she made her way down the narrow corridor, smoothing her apron with trembling hands, before knocking on the heavy wooden door. "Enter," Harwin's voice growled from within. She stepped inside to find him standing behind his desk, his broad frame tense, his eyes hard with a fury he was struggling to contain. Beside him stood his wife, Delia, a thin woman with a permanently pinched expression, and their daughter Priscilla, who had never once in 18 years spoken a kind word to Lyra. "Close the door," Harwin ordered. Lyra obeyed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What exactly did you say to the Alpha King last night?" Harwin demanded, the moment the latch clicked shut. "And do not lie to me, girl. I want the truth." "I said very little, my lord," Lyra answered carefully. "He asked where I was born. I told him I did not know, that I was found as an infant at the edge of the territory. That is all." "That is all," Priscilla repeated mockingly, folding her arms. As if a kitchen girl could hold the attention of the Alpha King with nothing more than a story about being abandoned. "Priscilla," Delia murmured, though there was no real reprimand in her tone. Harwin paced behind his desk, his boots striking the stone floor with heavy, deliberate steps. "He asked me this morning, before departing to inspect the boundary, whether our pack records included any information about the year you were found. He asked about a fire that occurred in the Northern Territories 20 years ago. He asked, specifically, whether any survivors from that fire had ever been located." Lyra's breath caught. "What fire?" Harwin's eyes snapped to hers, cold and calculating. "You truly do not know, do you?" "Know what?" "Please, my lord. If there is something about my past that concerns me, I have a right to understand it." "You have no rights in this house," Harwin snapped, slamming his palm against the desk hard enough to make Delia flinch. "You have shelter because I allowed it. You have a name because I gave it to you. And you will remember that before you go stirring curiosity in the mind of the most dangerous wolf in the 12 packs." Lyra lowered her eyes, old habits of submission rising up automatically even as something new and unfamiliar burned quietly beneath her ribs. For the first time in her life, she did not fully believe the words being used to diminish her. "I did not ask him to take interest in me," she said quietly. "I did nothing but spill a bowl of soup." "And yet here we are," Harwin muttered, dragging a hand down his face. "Listen carefully. When the Alpha King returns from his boundary inspection, you will not speak to him again, unless directly commanded. You will not answer questions about your past. You will say you know nothing, because that is the truth, and there is nothing more to discuss. Do you understand me?" "Yes, my lord," Lyra whispered, though something inside her rebelled quietly against the order, even as she spoke it aloud. "Good. Now get back to your duties before he returns and finds you idling about." Lyra fled the study as quickly as she could without appearing to run, her mind spinning with the fragments of information she had just gathered. A fire in the Northern Territories 20 years ago. Survivors who had never been located. Harwin's fury, sharp enough to border on fear. None of it made sense on its own, yet together it painted the edges of something enormous, something the head of her own pack was desperate to keep buried. She found Mabel in the kitchen garden, gathering herbs for the midday meal, and quickly relayed everything Harwin had said. The old woman's hands stilled over a patch of rosemary, her expression darkening. "A fire," Mabel repeated softly. "Yes, I remember it now. more clearly than I wished to. It happened the same season you were found, child. The northern forest burned for 3 days. Nobody from Blackthorn traveled that far to see it firsthand, but the smoke was visible even from our watchtowers. There were rumors afterward, terrible rumors, of an entire pack destroyed in a single night. A royal pack, some said, though such talk was quickly silenced by the elders. A royal pack, Lyra echoed, the words settling strangely in her chest, as though some distant part of her recognized them, even though her mind could not explain why. The Silvermoon line, Mabel said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else stood within earshot. I have not spoken that name aloud in 20 years. They ruled a territory far to the north, known for silver-furred wolves, and a bloodline said to carry gifts beyond ordinary shifting. Strength, healing, some even whispered of visions, and then, in a single terrible night, they were gone. Every report claimed the entire line had been wiped out, hunted down to the last cub. Lyra's pulse pounded in her ears. Every report except one, she said slowly, understanding dawning like cold water down her spine. Because I was found 3 days later, at the edge of Blackthorn territory, with no explanation for where I came from. Mabel met her eyes, and for the first time, the old woman did not attempt to hide the fear and wonder, swirling together on her weathered face. Yes, child. I believe that is exactly what happened. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Lyra. She moved through her duties mechanically, scrubbing, sweeping, carrying, her body performing tasks it had performed 10,000 times before, while her mind raced through an entirely different landscape. Silver-furred wolves, a bloodline wiped out in a single night, a fire that had burned for 3 days across the northern horizon, and somehow, impossibly, herself, a nameless servant girl, raised on scraps and insults, standing at the center of a mystery that could shake every pack in the 12 territories to its foundation. She did not see Cade again until well after sunset, when he returned from his boundary inspection covered in the dust and grit of a long day's travel. She was carrying a basket of clean linens down the eastern corridor when she rounded a corner and nearly collided directly into his broad chest. Careful, he said, steadying her with a firm hand on her shoulder before she could stumble backward. My lord, forgive me. I did not see you, Lyra said quickly, stepping back and lowering her eyes exactly as Harwin had instructed. But Cade did not release her shoulder immediately. Look at me, Lyra. She hesitated, torn between Harwin's explicit orders and the strange gravity of the man standing before her, before finally lifting her gaze to meet his. Whatever he saw there made his expression shift, sharpen, focus, with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Harwin ordered you to avoid me, he said. It was not a question. Lyra said nothing, which was answer enough. I thought as much, Cade said grimly, releasing her shoulder and running a hand through his dark hair. I spent the day speaking with the oldest wolves along the northern boundary, the ones who remember the fire 20 years ago. Their accounts confirm what I feared. There were no survivors reported from the Silvermoon massacre. None. Every single member of that royal line was believed destroyed in a single night, their entire territory reduced to ash. Mabel told me the same thing, Lyra admitted quietly. She said the fire burned for 3 days, and that I was found only 3 days after it began. Something dangerous and determined settled over Cade's features. Then it is no longer a question of whether you carry Silvermoon blood, Lyra. It is only a question of how you survived when no one else did, and who among the 12 packs might still wish to ensure that secret stays buried. Lyra's blood ran cold. You believe someone is still hunting for survivors? I believe, Cade said slowly, that whoever destroyed an entire royal bloodline in a single night would not hesitate to finish the task if they learned even one heir had slipped through their grasp. Which means, Lyra Ashworth, that from this moment forward, your life may be in far greater danger than you have ever imagined. The linens slipped from Lyra's arms and scattered across the corridor floor, forgotten entirely as the weight of his words settled over her like a shadow blotting out the last fading light of day. How do you know these things? Lyra asked, kneeling quickly to gather the scattered linens, her hands unsteady. How do you know so much about a bloodline everyone believes was destroyed 20 years ago? Cade knelt beside her, helping her collect the fallen cloths, his movements calm, despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. Because I was the one who found the wreckage, he said quietly. I was young then, barely more than a cub myself, traveling with my father along the northern trade routes when we came across the burned remains of Silvermoon territory. I have never forgotten the smell of that place. Ash and something worse beneath it. My father forbade me from speaking of it for years, said some memories were better left buried. I did not understand why, until now. Lyra straightened slowly, clutching the linens against her chest like a shield. And you believe I am connected to that memory? I do not believe it, Cade said, meeting her eyes with unsettling certainty. I know it. The moment you looked up at me in that hall, I smelled something I have not smelled in 20 years. A trace so faint, most wolves would miss it entirely, buried beneath years of suppression and fear, but unmistakable to anyone who was there that night. You carry Silvermoon blood, Lyra. The only question now is how deeply that blood runs, and how much danger it places you in. Somewhere down the corridor, a door creaked open, and the sound of approaching footsteps sent both of them stepping apart instinctively. Priscilla emerged from the shadows, her sharp eyes flicking between them with poorly concealed suspicion. My lord, she said sweetly, dipping into an exaggerated curtsy. Forgive the intrusion. Mother wondered if you required anything before retiring for the evening. Nothing at all, Cade said smoothly, his expression shifting instantly back into the cool, unreadable mask of a king. I was simply asking one of your servants for directions to the guest quarters. Priscilla's gaze lingered on Lyra a moment longer, calculating and cold, before she smiled thinly. Of course, my lord, I would be happy to escort you myself. That will not be necessary, Cade said, already turning away. He paused only long enough to glance back at Lyra one final time, his eyes carrying a silent promise that made her pulse quicken, despite the fear coiling through her chest. Rest well, Lyra Ashworth. Tomorrow, we begin uncovering the truth, whether Blackthorn wishes it or not. He disappeared down the corridor, with Priscilla trailing reluctantly behind him, and Lyra stood alone once more, clutching an armful of forgotten linens, her entire understanding of herself unraveling thread by thread with every passing hour. For 18 years, she had believed herself nameless, unwanted, cursed by circumstances no one would explain. Now, for the first time, she began to wonder if the truth had simply been waiting all along for someone powerful enough, and brave enough, to finally uncover it. A sharp knock on Harwin's study door pulled him away from his ledgers, before dawn had even fully broken over Blackthorn territory. He opened it to find one of his own guards standing pale-faced in the hallway, flanked by two wolves wearing the deep gray uniform of the Royal Investigators, an office that answered only to the Alpha King himself. Forgive the early hour, the lead investigator said, a lean woman named Odessa, with sharp eyes and a voice that left no room for argument. The Alpha King has requested a formal review of all records pertaining to a servant girl in your household, Lyra Ashworth. Harwin's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside to let them enter, knowing better than to refuse a direct order carrying the king's seal. Our records on the girl are minimal, he said carefully. She was found abandoned as an infant. We have no birth record, no family history, nothing beyond the date she was taken in. Then we will begin with what you do have, Odessa said, moving into the study without waiting for further permission, and with the item she carried when she was found. Harwin's expression flickered, just for a moment, something close to alarm passing behind his eyes before he masked it. There was no item, he said, only the infant herself, wrapped in an old blanket. That is not what our records indicate, Odessa said calmly, producing a folded document from within her cloak. According to the original intake report filed by your own predecessor 18 years ago, the infant was found wearing a small silver locket, broken and tarnished, engraved with a symbol that the report's author did not recognize. Where is that locket now? The color drained slightly from Harwin's face. I was not aware such an item existed. Perhaps it was lost over the years, or discarded as worthless. Perhaps, Odessa said, though her tone made clear she did not believe him for a moment. We will need to speak with the girl directly. Lyra was summoned from the kitchen for the second time in as many days, her stomach twisting with dread, as Greta ushered her hastily toward Harwin's study, muttering under her breath about the indignity of royal investigators, tramping through a respectable household before the morning meal had even been served. When Lyra stepped inside and saw the two gray uniformed strangers standing beside a visibly shaken Harwin, her heart began to pound. Lyra Ashworth, Odessa said, her sharp eyes sweeping over her with clinical precision. We understand you were found as an infant, wearing a small silver locket. Do you still possess this item? Lyra's hand rose instinctively to her chest, where beneath her worn tunic hung the one possession she had carried her entire life. A broken locket she had never once removed since she was old enough to understand what it meant to her. Yes, she said quietly. I have always kept it. Nobody ever asked about it before. May we examine it? Lyra glanced toward Harwin, whose expression had gone carefully blank, before reaching beneath her collar and lifting the thin chain over her head. She held the small tarnished locket out with trembling fingers, feeling strangely exposed without its familiar weight against her skin, for the first time in 18 years. Odessa took it with careful, reverent hands, turning it over slowly to examine the engraving on its surface, a design worn smooth by decades but still faintly visible beneath the tarnish. Her sharp eyes widened almost imperceptibly. This is the Silvermoon Royal Crest, she said quietly, glancing toward her fellow investigator, who leaned in to examine it as well, his own expression shifting from professional neutrality to something closer to shock. I have only ever seen this symbol in historical records. It was believed lost entirely when the line was destroyed 20 years ago. Harwin's face had gone nearly white. I did not know, he said quickly. I swear on my own bloodline, I did not know the girl carried anything of significance. Had I known, I would have. Would have what? Odessa asked coolly, cutting him off. Reported it to the proper authorities, as required by law, or ensured it disappeared along with any inconvenient questions it might raise. Harwin said nothing, his silence answer enough for everyone in the room. Odessa turned back to Lyra, her expression softening slightly, though her eyes remained sharp and assessing. This locket will need to be examined further by the royal archivists. In the meantime, the Alpha King has requested your presence at a formal gathering this evening, where he intends to discuss what has been discovered so far with the visiting pack leaders who remain in the territory. Me? Lyra's voice came out smaller than she intended. Why would he want me present at such a gathering? Because, Miss Ashworth, Odessa said, a strange note of something almost like respect entering her voice. If what this locket suggests proves true, you may be the last surviving member of a royal bloodline believed extinguished 20 years ago. And that is not a matter that can remain hidden in a servant's quarters any longer. The room seemed to tilt slightly beneath Lyra's feet. She had spent her entire existence believing herself worthless, unwanted, a burden tolerated only out of grudging pity. Now, within the span of 2 days, she was being told she might be the missing heir to an entire royal line, a truth so enormous she could hardly begin to process its weight. Harwin recovered his composure enough to step forward, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. Surely this can wait until the matter is properly investigated. The girl has duties to attend to, and such wild speculation before any confirmation seems reckless. The Alpha King does not speculate recklessly, Odessa said, fixing him with a cool stare that made even the imposing Harwin shrink back slightly. He has already ordered a formal blood ritual to be conducted at tonight's gathering, to confirm or deny the truth once and for all. Silvermoon blood cannot be faked, and it cannot be hidden, not under the light of a blood moon. A blood ritual. Lyra had heard whispers of such ceremonies throughout her life, ancient rites used only in the rarest of circumstances to verify true lineage among the pack bloodlines, rituals so serious that false claims were often punished severely. If she truly carried no royal blood, the ritual would reveal her a fraud in front of every visiting alpha still remaining in Blackthorn territory, an embarrassment that would likely cost her far more than her position in the household. But if the ritual proved true, everything she had ever believed about herself would be shattered and rebuilt in a single terrible, beautiful moment. I will attend, Lyra said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. 18 years of silence and submission suddenly felt like a weight she was ready to set down, whatever the outcome might be. Odessa nodded once, satisfied, before turning to address Harwin directly. See that she is prepared and presentable by sunset. The Alpha King does not tolerate delays, and neither, I suspect, does the truth. As the investigators departed the study, Harwin rounded on Lyra with barely contained fury simmering beneath his carefully controlled expression. Do you understand what you are risking? He hissed once they were alone. If this ritual fails, if you are exposed as nothing more than an ordinary orphan, grasping at delusions of grandeur, the humiliation will follow you for the rest of your life. You will never be able to show your face among any pack again. And if it succeeds, Lyra asked, meeting his eyes with a boldness she had never before dared to show him. What then, Harwin? What happens to a man who has spent 18 years abusing and degrading a girl who turns out to carry royal blood in her veins? For the first time in her life, Lyra watched genuine fear flicker across Harwin's face, and she realized, with a strange and dizzying clarity, that whatever happened tonight, nothing between them would ever be the same again. By evening, word of the coming ritual had spread through every corner of Blackthorn territory, like wildfire through dry grass. The remaining visiting alphas, curious about why Cade had lingered so long past the summit's official end, gathered once more in the Great Hall, their whispered conversations filling the room with a nervous, electric energy that Lyra could feel pressing against her skin the moment she stepped through the doors. Mabel had helped her prepare, brushing out her hair with careful hands and dressing her in the only clean tunic Lyra owned, a simple gray garment far too plain for such a momentous occasion. But it was all she had. As they worked, Mabel had squeezed her shoulder gently and whispered words of quiet encouragement, though even the old cook's weathered face carried lines of worry she could not fully hide. "Whatever happens tonight," Mabel had said, "remember that your worth was never decided by a ritual, child. It was decided the moment you survived what no one else did." Now, standing at the edge of the Great Hall in her plain gray tunic, surrounded by the finely dressed nobility of a dozen different packs, Lyra felt smaller and more exposed than she ever had in her life. Every eye in the room turned toward her as she entered, whispers rippling outward like water disturbed by a stone. Cade stood at the center of the hall beside a raised stone altar she had never seen before, its surface carved with ancient symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the candlelight. Beside him stood Odessa and several other members of the Royal Investigative Office, along with an elderly wolf Lyra did not recognize, dressed in ceremonial robes that marked him as one of the rare pack elders trained in the old rites. "Lyra Ashworth," Cade said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed hall. "Come forward." Her legs felt unsteady as she crossed the room, aware of every judgmental stare, every whispered comment passing between the gathered nobility. Priscilla stood near the front with her mother, wearing an expression of barely concealed glee, clearly anticipating a humiliating failure that would put the upstart servant girl back in her proper place. Harwin stood rigid nearby, his face carefully blank, though Lyra could see the tension coiled tight in his shoulders. "This ritual," the elderly wolf explained once Lyra had reached the altar, his voice thin but carrying clearly through the silent hall, "will reveal the truth of this young woman's bloodline beyond any doubt. A single drop of blood placed upon the sacred stone beneath the light of tonight's blood moon will glow according to its true nature. Ordinary blood will show no reaction. Royal blood, however, carries within it an ancient resonance that cannot be disguised or falsified." "And if her blood shows nothing?" Priscilla called out from the crowd, unable to contain herself. "What then? Will this pack finally admit that she has always been nothing more than an ordinary worthless orphan?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through parts of the crowd, though Cade's sharp glare silenced it quickly. "If her blood shows nothing," he said coldly, "then we will have our answer, and I will personally see to it that no further claims are made regarding her heritage. But mark my words, if her blood proves what I already suspect it will, those who mocked her here tonight will remember this moment for the rest of their lives." Lyra's hands trembled as the elderly wolf produced a small ceremonial blade, its edge thin and precise. "Are you prepared to proceed, child?" he asked gently, his eyes carrying none of the mockery she saw in so many others watching from the crowd. She thought of 18 years of insults, of Harwin's cruel words and Priscilla's endless mockery, of Mabel's quiet kindness, and the strange, steady warmth in Cade's eyes whenever he looked at her. Whatever happened next, she was tired of hiding, tired of shrinking herself down to fit the smallest possible space in the world. "I am ready," she said, and her voice, for once, did not shake. The elderly wolf took her hand gently and drew the blade across her palm, quick and precise, a small line of crimson welling up immediately. Lyra winced, but did not pull away, as he guided her hand over the ancient stone altar, allowing a single drop of blood to fall onto its carved surface. For a moment, nothing happened. The hall held its breath collectively, the silence so complete that Lyra could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Priscilla's lips curved into a triumphant smirk, and Harwin's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though already anticipating vindication. Then the drop of blood began to glow. It started faintly at first, a soft shimmer of silvery light spreading outward from where her blood had touched the stone, growing brighter with each passing second, until the entire altar seemed to pulse with an otherworldly luminescence, bathing the surrounding hall in a soft silver glow that reflected off every stunned face in the crowd. Gasps rippled outward like a wave crashing against the shore. Someone near the back of the hall dropped a goblet, the sound of shattering glass lost entirely beneath the collective murmur of shock and disbelief. "Silvermoon," the elderly wolf whispered, his eyes wide with something between awe and reverence. "By the old gods, the child carries true Silvermoon blood." Priscilla's triumphant smirk collapsed into slack-jawed horror. Harwin stumbled back a step, his face draining of all color as the full weight of 18 years of cruelty came crashing down around him in a single silent, silver-lit moment. Delia clutched her daughter's arm, both women staring at Lyra as though seeing her for the very first time. Cade stepped forward, his expression carrying none of the shock rippling through the rest of the hall, only a fierce, quiet satisfaction, as though a puzzle he had been assembling for 2 days had finally clicked into place exactly as he suspected it would. He knelt before the altar, before Lyra, before the entire assembled nobility of a dozen visiting packs, and bowed his head. "All hail the last heir of Silvermoon," he said, his voice ringing clear and unwavering through the stunned silence of the hall. One by one, hesitantly at first and then with growing certainty, the other pack representatives began to kneel as well, until the entire great hall was filled with bowed heads and lowered eyes, every single wolf who had once looked upon Lyra with pity or contempt, now paying homage to the silver glow still shimmering faintly on the ancient stone before her. Lyra stood frozen at the center of it all, her bleeding palm forgotten, her mind struggling to comprehend the impossible reality unfolding around her. 18 years of being called worthless, cursed, unwanted, and now an entire hall of powerful wolves knelt before her as though she were something precious beyond measure. She looked up and found Cade's eyes still fixed on her, steady and unwavering, even as he remained kneeling before her like everyone else in the hall. In that single silent moment, surrounded by the glow of silver light and the weight of a truth 18 years buried, Lyra Ashworth finally understood that her old life, the one filled with insults and invisibility, had ended the instant that single drop of blood touched the ancient stone. Whatever came next, there would be no returning to the girl she had been just 2 days before. The silver glow on the ancient altar had barely faded before the great hall erupted into chaos. Voices rose over one another in a confused storm of disbelief, excitement, and fear, as the assembled pack leaders scrambled to understand what the ritual's undeniable result meant for the fragile balance of power among the 12 packs. Somewhere in the crowd, an older alpha muttered about ancient prophecies concerning the return of Silvermoon blood, while another argued loudly that such superstitions had no place in modern pack politics. Cade rose from his kneeling position and raised a single hand, and the entire hall fell silent almost instantly, as though his authority alone could smother the rising storm of confusion. "This discovery changes much," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed space. "But it changes nothing about how this young woman has been treated within these walls for the past 18 years. His gaze shifted deliberately toward Harwin, who stood pale and trembling near the front of the crowd. Delia and Priscilla huddled close beside him, as though seeking shelter from a storm they knew was coming. "Harwin of Blackthorn," Cade said, his voice dropping into something cold and dangerous, "you have sheltered the last surviving heir of the Silvermoon line within your household for 18 years, and in that time, you have treated her not as a guest deserving of protection, but as a burden to be degraded and dismissed at every opportunity. Do you deny this?" Harwin's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. "My lord, I did not know. Ignorance of her bloodline does not excuse cruelty toward any wolf under your protection," Cade cut in sharply. "I witnessed your own household's contempt for her with my own eyes, the very first evening I arrived. I do not need further evidence of how she has been treated." A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. Several of the visiting alphas exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recalculating their own past interactions with Blackthorn's household staff, wondering how many of them had witnessed similar cruelty without ever questioning it. "I will not allow this to stand unaddressed," Cade continued, turning to address the full assembly of pack leaders. "Effective immediately, Blackthorn Pack standing among the 12 territories is suspended, pending a full investigation into the treatment of Lyra Ashworth, heir of Silvermoon, during her time under this roof. Harwin, you will surrender your seat at the Alpha Council until such investigation concludes. Gasps rippled through the crowd once more. Suspension from the council was a punishment reserved for only the most severe violations of pack law, a humiliation that would follow Harwin and his family for generations to come. Delia let out a strangled sound of protest, while Priscilla's face crumpled into something between fury and disbelief. "My lord, please," Harwin begged, all pretense of dignity abandoned entirely. "Whatever punishment you deem fit for me personally, I ask that you spare my family from. Your family stood beside you every single day, while this girl suffered beneath your roof," Cade said flatly. "They are not innocent bystanders to your cruelty. They are participants in it." Lyra watched the exchange with a strange, distant sense of unreality, as though observing the collapse of Harwin's authority from somewhere outside her own body. Part of her wanted to feel triumphant, vindicated after 18 years of enduring his contempt, but a larger part of her simply felt exhausted, hollowed out by the enormity of everything happening around her. "My lord," she said quietly, surprising even herself by speaking up amid the chaos. "May I say something?" Cade turned toward her immediately, his expression softening slightly. "Of course." The hall quieted once more, every eye turning toward the small gray-clad figure standing beside the glowing altar. Lyra took a steadying breath, aware of the weight of so many stares, yet finding, for the first time, that she did not shrink beneath them. "I do not seek revenge," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. 18 years of cruelty cannot be undone by punishing this family further than necessary. I only ask that whatever justice is served, it be fair, and that it finally end the suffering of any other servant within this household who has been treated as I was, simply because they had no bloodline important enough to protect them. A murmur of surprised approval passed through parts of the crowd. Even Cade seemed momentarily taken aback by her words, something like admiration flickering behind his winter-colored eyes. "Your mercy speaks well of the blood you carry," he said finally. "Very well. Harwin, your formal punishment will be determined by full council review, taking into account both the severity of your household's conduct and the mercy requested by the very woman you wronged. But suspension from the council stands, effective immediately, and Blackthorn territory will remain under royal oversight until the investigation concludes." Harwin sagged with something between relief and continued despair, clearly understanding that while Lyra's mercy had spared him the harshest possible punishment, his standing among the 12 packs had still been shattered beyond easy repair. As the hall slowly began to empty, pack leaders departing in hushed, urgent clusters to discuss the night's astonishing revelations, Cade approached Lyra where she still stood beside the ancient altar, her bleeding palm now wrapped in a clean cloth by one of the attending healers. "You surprised me tonight," he said quietly, once they were mostly alone amid the emptying hall. "I surprised myself," Lyra admitted, glancing down at her bandaged hand. "I have spent my entire life being told I was worthless. I do not know how to suddenly become someone important." "You are not becoming someone important," Cade said gently. "You already were. You simply did not know it yet, and the mercy you showed tonight, even toward the man who mistreated you for 18 years, proves you carry far more nobility in your heart than most wolves born into royal bloodlines ever managed to display." Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks at the quiet intensity in his voice. "What happens now?" "Now," Cade said, "we must uncover who destroyed your family 20 years ago, and why. A survivor of that massacre, standing alive and revealed before an entire assembly of pack leaders, will not go unnoticed for long. Whoever orchestrated that attack will learn of tonight's events soon enough, if they have not already, and when they do, they will not simply allow the last heir of Silvermoon to live freely without attempting to finish what they started 2 decades ago." A chill settled over Lyra despite the lingering warmth of the great hall. "You believe I am still in danger." "I know you are," Cade said grimly, "which is why, effective tonight, you will no longer remain under Blackthorn's roof. You will travel with me to my own territory, where I can ensure your protection properly, while we uncover the truth behind what happened to your family." Lyra's breath caught. Leaving Blackthorn territory, the only home she had ever known despite its cruelty, felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff into unknown darkness. And yet, standing there in the fading silver glow of the ancient altar, She realized she had never truly belonged to Blackthorn at all. Perhaps it was finally time to discover where she truly belonged. "I will go with you," she said quietly, "on one condition." Cade raised an eyebrow, clearly not accustomed to conditions being placed upon his decisions. "And what condition is that?" "Mabel comes with me," Lyra said firmly. "She is the only person in this household who ever showed me genuine kindness. I will not leave her behind to face whatever consequences follow tonight's revelations alone." A faint, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of Cade's mouth, the first genuine warmth Lyra had seen cross his face since they met. "Very well, Lyra Ashworth of Silvermoon. Your first act as a recognized heir, and already you are negotiating terms with an Alpha King. I suspect this will not be the last time you surprise me." Outside, beyond the tall windows of the Great Hall, the blood moon still hung heavy and crimson in the night sky, bearing silent witness to the moment everything Lyra had ever believed about her own worth had finally, irrevocably changed. The journey to Cade's territory took 3 full days, winding through forests and river valleys Lyra had never seen beyond the borders of Blackthorn land. She rode in a covered carriage alongside Mabel, who had accepted the sudden upheaval of her entire life with remarkable calm, muttering only that she had always suspected something extraordinary lay beneath Lyra's quiet exterior. Cade rode alongside the carriage for much of the journey, accompanied by a small escort of his most trusted guards, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the surrounding tree line, as though expecting an ambush at any moment. Lyra noticed the tension in his shoulders never fully eased, even during the quiet hours of travel, when nothing stirred beyond birdsong and rustling leaves. "You are worried," she said on the second evening, as they made camp beside a slow-moving river, the fire crackling softly between them, while the rest of the escort settled into their own tents nearby. "I am cautious," Cade corrected, though the admission in his eyes told a different story. "Word of your revealed bloodline will have spread through every pack in the 12 territories by now. Whoever destroyed Silvermoon 20 years ago will have heard of it as well. I would be a poor protector if I did not consider every possible danger that news might invite." "Do you have any idea who was responsible?" Lyra asked, settling closer to the fire's warmth. "For the massacre, I mean." Cade's expression darkened. "I have suspicions, but no proof. The official reports from 20 years ago claimed the attack came from an unnamed rival pack seeking to expand their territory. But Silvermoon was never at war with any neighboring pack that I am aware of. They kept largely to themselves, valued for their rare gifts, but rarely involved in the political struggles that consumed the rest of the 12 territories. An attack of that scale, precise enough to eliminate an entire royal bloodline in a single night, required resources and coordination that few packs could have managed alone." "You believe it was someone from within the council itself," Lyra said slowly, understanding dawning with cold clarity. "I believe it is possible," Cade said carefully, "which is precisely why I have not yet accused anyone directly, nor will I, until I possess proof strong enough to withstand scrutiny. An accusation against a fellow Alpha, made without solid evidence, could fracture the fragile peace between the 12 packs entirely." Lyra stared into the flickering flames, turning his words over in her mind. "Then how do we find proof, after 20 years?" "We start with what remains of Silvermoon territory itself," Cade said. "I have not returned there since the day my father and I discovered the wreckage. It is possible that time and searching have overlooked something important, some clue buried among the ashes that might point us toward the truth." "You wish to take me there," Lyra said, understanding his intention before he spoke it aloud. "Only if you are willing," Cade said, his voice softening slightly. "I would not force such a journey upon you. Returning to the site of your family's destruction, even without conscious memory of that night, may prove difficult, in ways neither of us can fully anticipate." Lyra considered his words carefully, feeling the weight of Mabel's steady presence beside her, the old woman having fallen into a light doze against a rolled blanket near the fire. "I want to go," she said finally. "I have spent 18 years not knowing where I came from. I would rather face difficult truths than continue living in ignorance, however painful those truths might prove to be." Something like respect flickered across Cade's face in the firelight. "Very well. We will alter our course tomorrow and travel north, toward what remains of Silvermoon territory, before continuing on to my own lands." They set out again at first light, the escort's mood growing noticeably more tense as they left the familiar southern roads behind. and pressed northward, into wilder, less traveled country. By the following afternoon, the forest around them began to change, the healthy green canopy giving way gradually to something starker and more desolate. Ancient trees, standing blackened and skeletal against the pale sky, evidence of a fire that had burned so hot and so thoroughly that even 2 decades of regrowth had not fully erased its scars. Lyra stepped down from the carriage when they finally reached the heart of what had once been Silvermoon territory, her breath catching at the sight before her. Where a thriving pack settlement had once stood, only crumbling foundations remained, overgrown with hardy weeds that had managed to claim the blackened earth despite everything working against them. A haunting silence hung over the entire clearing, broken only by the whisper of wind through skeletal branches. This was the central hall, Cade said quietly, walking beside her toward the largest ruin, a collapsed structure of blackened stone that must have once been an imposing building. I remember it clearly, even now. The fire had already burned itself out by the time my father and I arrived, but the destruction was— He paused, his jaw tightening. It was thorough, deliberate. Whoever did this wanted to ensure nothing, and no one survived. Lyra moved slowly through the ruins, her hand trailing along a crumbling stone wall, feeling an inexplicable pull toward a particular section of the wreckage that seemed to draw her forward, despite having no conscious memory of this place at all. She knelt beside a partially collapsed archway, brushing away 20 years of dirt and debris with careful fingers, uncertain what she was even searching for. Her fingers brushed against something solid buried just beneath the surface, and she began digging more urgently, ignoring the dirt collecting beneath her fingernails, until she uncovered a small metal box, tarnished and dented, but still largely intact, clearly built to withstand exactly the kind of destruction that had consumed everything around it. "Cade," she called, her voice tight with disbelief. He crossed the clearing quickly, kneeling beside her to examine her discovery. "This is remarkable," he murmured, carefully lifting the box free of the surrounding dirt. Silvermoon craftsmen were known for their metalwork. This box appears designed specifically to survive extreme conditions. Someone placed this here deliberately, expecting it might need to withstand exactly what happened that night. His hands trembled slightly as he worked at the box's tarnished latch, finally forcing it open after several attempts. Inside, protected from 2 decades of weather and decay, lay a collection of folded documents and a single sealed letter, the wax seal bearing the unmistakable crest of the Silvermoon royal line. "These are official pack records," Cade said, carefully unfolding the topmost document, his eyes scanning quickly across faded but still legible handwriting. "Correspondence, financial records, and this." He paused, his expression shifting into something sharp and focused. "This appears to be a list of trade agreements between Silvermoon and several other packs, dated only weeks before the attack." Lyra leaned closer, her heart pounding. "Does it mention who they were trading with?" Cade's finger traced down the faded ink, and his expression darkened considerably as he reached the bottom of the document. "Yes," he said quietly. "And one name on this list belongs to a pack whose current alpha sits on the council to this very day, a pack that has grown remarkably wealthy and powerful in the 20 years since Silvermoon's destruction, filling much of the territorial and political vacuum left behind." "Who?" Lyra whispered, though some instinctive part of her already dreaded the answer. Cade looked up from the document, his winter-colored eyes hard with cold, dawning certainty. "Alaric Thornwood," he said. "Alpha of the Thornwood Pack, and one of the most trusted voices on the entire Alpha Council. If these trade records suggest any conflict or betrayal between Silvermoon and Thornwood in the weeks before the massacre, we may finally be looking at the true architect of your family's destruction." The wind picked up across the ruined clearing, rustling through blackened branches like a whispered warning, as Lyra realized that uncovering the truth of her past had only just begun to reveal how dangerous the path ahead might truly become. They made camp that night just beyond the ruined boundaries of Silvermoon territory, the discovery of Alaric Thornwood's name casting a heavy silence over the entire escort. Cade had said little since reading the trade documents, his expression carrying the particular stillness of a man working through implications far too dangerous to speak aloud carelessly. "You know him," Lyra said quietly, once Mabel had settled into her tent for the evening, and the two of them sat alone beside the fire, the recovered metal box resting between them, like a coiled threat neither wished to touch again just yet. I have known Alaric for most of my adult life, Cade admitted. He sat on the council long before I inherited my father's seat. He has always presented himself as measured, reasonable, a voice of caution, amid the more volatile personalities among the 12 packs. I have trusted his counsel on matters both large and small for years. But now you suspect he orchestrated the destruction of an entire bloodline, Lyra said. I suspect nothing yet, Cade said carefully, though the tension in his voice suggested otherwise. Trade records alone prove nothing beyond the fact that Silvermoon and Thornwood conducted business together, which is hardly unusual among neighboring territories. I must see the remaining documents before drawing any conclusions. They spent the next several hours poring over the recovered papers by firelight, Cade translating portions of the more formal correspondence, while Lyra read through the personal letters, her chest tightening with each new detail about the family she had never known she possessed. There were letters from a woman, who must have been her mother, warm and affectionate correspondence, addressed to a beloved daughter, whose name, Lyra realized with a start, had also been Lyra, a family name, passed down through generations of Silvermoon women. My mother, she whispered, tracing the elegant handwriting with trembling fingers. She wrote about a daughter, about me. Cade looked up from his own documents, his expression softening at the raw emotion in her voice. What does she say? Lyra's eyes swam with unexpected tears as she read the fragile, faded words aloud. She writes about teaching her daughter to sing the old moon songs, about plans for a celebration when the child turned 1 year old, still months away at the time this letter was written. Her voice cracked slightly. I never knew any of this. I never even knew her name. Elara, Cade said quietly, glancing at the letter's elegant signature. Elara Silvermoon. I remember hearing that name spoken with great respect among the older generation, though I was too young myself to have known her personally. Lyra pressed the letter gently against her chest, allowing herself a moment of quiet grief for a mother she had never had the chance to know, for an entire life that had been stolen from her before she was even old enough to remember it. Mabel's earlier words echoed in her mind. Your worth was never decided by a ritual. It was decided the moment you survived what no one else did. She set the letter aside carefully and returned her attention to the remaining documents, determined to honor her mother's memory by uncovering the full truth of what had happened. Near the bottom of the stack, she found a shorter, more urgent-looking note, written in a different, more hurried hand than the careful script of her mother's letters. Cade, she said, her voice sharpening. Look at this one. He leaned over to read the note, his expression growing grim as he absorbed its contents. The letter, apparently written by her father only days before the massacre, spoke of growing tension with a neighboring pack over disputed mining rights along the northern border, tension that had escalated far beyond simple trade disagreements. It mentioned threats received, and a decision to seek protection from the Alpha Council should the situation continue to deteriorate. He was afraid, Lyra said quietly. My father knew something dangerous was coming. And he named no specific pack in this letter, Cade noted, frowning as he reread the passage carefully. Only vague references to a neighboring rival, growing increasingly hostile over territorial disputes. This alone is not enough to confirm Thornwood's involvement definitively, though it certainly does not rule it out. What do we do now? Lyra asked. Cade set the letter down thoughtfully, staring into the crackling fire for a long moment before answering. We proceed carefully. I cannot simply accuse a sitting Council Alpha of orchestrating genocide based on circumstantial trade records and a vague, unnamed threat mentioned in a 20-year-old letter. Alaric would deny everything, and without stronger proof, such an accusation could fracture the Council entirely, potentially plunging the 12 packs into the very conflict Silvermoon's destruction was likely meant to prevent, through fear and consolidation of power. Then how do we find stronger proof? We continue investigating quietly, Cade said. I will have my most trusted people examine Thornwood's territorial expansion over the past 20 years, tracing exactly how his pack grew so significantly wealthier and more powerful following Silvermoon's destruction. If Alaric truly orchestrated this massacre to seize territory and resources for himself, there should be a trail of evidence somewhere, however carefully it may have been concealed over the years. Lyra nodded slowly, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach at the thought of confronting whoever had destroyed her family so completely. And what of me? Do I simply wait quietly while you investigate? Cade's eyes met hers across the firelight, something fierce and protective flickering behind his usually controlled expression. You will remain under my protection at my own territory, while this investigation unfolds. I do not intend to allow harm to reach you after everything you have already survived, but I will not shield you from the truth either, Lyra. You deserve to know exactly what happened to your family, and to decide for yourself what justice looks like once we uncover it. A distant howl echoed somewhere beyond the tree line, causing several of the resting guards to stir instinctively, hands drifting toward weapons, before the sound faded into ordinary nighttime silence. Cade's sharp eyes scanned the darkness beyond their campfire's glow for several long moments before relaxing slightly, though his guard clearly remained heightened. We should rest, he said finally. Tomorrow we continue toward my territory, where you will be far safer than exposed out here in the open wilderness. Lyra gathered the precious documents carefully back into their protective metal box, cradling it against her chest, as though it contained the last fragile pieces of a life she was only just beginning to understand. As she settled into her own tent for the night, her mother's letter tucked safely inside her tunic against her heart, she found herself thinking not of fear, but of a strange, fierce determination settling over her like armor. Whoever had destroyed her family 20 years ago had believed they eliminated every trace of Silvermoon from the world entirely. They had been wrong. And now, with Cade Direwolf's power and resources behind her, Lyra intended to ensure that whoever was responsible for that terrible night would finally face the justice they had evaded for 2 decades. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with fragmented images of a mother's warm smile and a father's worried eyes, faces she had never truly known, yet somehow felt achingly familiar, as though some deep, ancestral part of her had been waiting 18 long years to finally remember them. Cade's territory greeted them on the 4th day of travel, with towering stone walls and banners bearing the Direwolf crest, a fortress far grander than anything Lyra had ever imagined existed among the 12 packs. Servants and guards alike bowed as their carriage passed through the main gates, and Lyra felt an uncomfortable flush of self-consciousness at the sudden shift in how she was perceived, no longer the invisible kitchen girl, but an honored guest, under the personal protection of the Alpha King himself. Mabel settled into her new quarters with cheerful practicality, immediately befriending several of the kitchen staff and declaring the castle's pantry the finest she had ever seen. Lyra, however, found the adjustment far more difficult, wandering the unfamiliar corridors with a persistent sense of not quite belonging, despite the newfound respect shown to her by everyone she encountered. It was nearly 2 weeks after their arrival when Corwin, Cade's trusted second, returned from a lengthy scouting mission with information that sent the entire castle into quiet, urgent motion. Lyra was summoned to Cade's private study late one evening, finding him standing over a large map spread across his desk, his expression grim in the flickering candlelight. Corwin has uncovered something significant, Cade said without preamble as she entered. Records from Thornwood's territorial expansion over the past 20 years show an unmistakable pattern. Every major boundary shift, every new mining claim, every valuable resource Thornwood's pack acquired following Silvermoon's destruction traces directly back to territory that once belonged to your family. Lyra moved closer to the map, studying the marked boundaries with growing unease. He took everything. Not immediately, Cade clarified. Alaric was patient. He allowed nearly 2 years to pass before beginning his territorial acquisitions, ensuring no obvious connection could be drawn between Silvermoon's destruction and his own pack's sudden expansion. But the pattern, once traced carefully over 2 full decades, is undeniable. Thornwood Pack has grown wealthier and more powerful, specifically by absorbing every resource Silvermoon once controlled. This is proof, Lyra said, her voice tight with a mixture of vindication and rising anger. It is strong circumstantial evidence, Cade corrected carefully, but Alaric will claim, likely correctly in some technical sense, that abandoned territory simply became available for legitimate claim following Silvermoon's destruction, regardless of who was responsible for that destruction in the first place. We need something more direct, something that connects him personally to the attack itself, not merely to its aftermath. Corwin, who had remained standing near the study door, cleared his throat carefully. My lord, there is one more matter worth mentioning. During my investigation, I encountered an elderly wolf living in seclusion near the Thornwood border, a former guard who served under Alaric's father decades ago. He spoke, quite reluctantly, of rumors circulating among Thornwood's oldest retainers, whispers of a hired mercenary pack contracted 20 years ago for what was described only as necessary territorial cleansing. Lyra's blood ran cold. A hired pack, to destroy my family. The old guard would not name the mercenaries directly, Corwin continued, claiming fear of retribution even after so many years. But he did mention that payment for their services was rumored to have been unusually large enough that Thornwood's treasury reportedly required years to fully recover from the expenditure, despite the territorial gains that followed shortly afterward. This is exactly the kind of direct connection we need, Cade said, his jaw tightening with barely restrained fury. If we can locate even one member of that mercenary pack still living, willing to testify to Alaric's involvement, we would have proof strong enough to bring before the full council, without fear of it being dismissed as mere speculation. How do we find them? Lyra asked. Mercenary packs of that scale do not simply disappear, Cade said. They often continue operating under different names, different territories, particularly if they were paid well enough to relocate and establish themselves elsewhere. Corwin, I want you to begin tracing any mercenary activity reported in the years immediately following Silvermoon's destruction. Someone, somewhere, will remember who was contracted for such an enormous undertaking. Corwin nodded and departed swiftly to begin the search, leaving Cade and Lyra alone once more in the candlelit study. Lyra sank into a nearby chair, suddenly feeling the full exhaustion of everything she had learned pressing down upon her shoulders. He destroyed an entire bloodline simply to expand his territory, she said quietly, more to herself than to Cade. My parents, every wolf in Silvermoon, all of them murdered simply because Alaric Thornwood wanted their land and their resources. I fear that may prove exactly true, Cade said gently, moving to sit beside her. I am sorry, Lyra. I know this truth brings little comfort, even as it finally answers questions you have carried your entire life. It brings something, Lyra said, surprising herself with the steadiness returning to her voice. It brings the beginning of justice. For 18 years, I believed myself worthless, a nameless burden nobody wanted. Now I understand that I was never worthless at all. I was simply the one piece of evidence Alaric Thornwood failed to destroy, the one loose thread that could eventually unravel everything he built upon my family's destruction. Cade studied her carefully in the flickering candlelight, something like profound respect and quiet admiration passing across his features. You are remarkable, you know, he said softly. Most wolves, upon learning such a devastating truth, would be consumed entirely by grief or vengeance. You seem to be finding, instead, a strange kind of strength. I have had a great deal of practice surviving difficult truths, Lyra said, a faint, weary smile tugging at her lips for the first time in what felt like days. Though I confess, none of my previous difficulties involved uncovering a genocide orchestrated by a sitting council alpha. A soft, surprised laugh escaped Cade, quickly quieted, though warmth lingered in his eyes as he studied her. No, he agreed. I imagine this particular difficulty is somewhat outside the ordinary scope of your experience. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the weight of the evening's revelations settling around them like the candlelight itself, flickering but steady. Outside the study's tall windows, the moon hung high and full over Cade's territory, illuminating a night that felt, despite everything, strangely peaceful. Whatever happens next, Cade said finally, his voice carrying quiet resolve, know that you will not face it alone. I intend to see justice served for Silvermoon, for your parents, and for every wolf who suffered because of Alaric Thornwood's ambition. This I promise you, Lyra of Silvermoon, upon my own standing as Alpha King. Lyra met his steady gaze, feeling something warm and unfamiliar settle into her chest, alongside the lingering ache of grief and anger. For the first time in her entire life, she did not feel alone in facing whatever difficult truths still lay ahead. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, unaware that his carefully hidden secret had finally begun unraveling after 20 years of careful concealment, Alaric Thornwood continued his ordinary evening routine, entirely ignorant of the storm quietly gathering against him. 3 weeks passed before Corwin returned, with news that changed everything. He arrived at Cade's fortress late one night, road-weary and grim-faced, requesting an immediate audience despite the late hour. Lyra was summoned alongside Cade, her heart pounding with anticipation, as Corwin unfolded a worn leather journal onto the study desk. "I found them," Corwin said without preamble. "The mercenary pack responsible for Silvermoon's destruction now operates under the name Ironclaw, having relocated to territory far east of here shortly after receiving payment 20 years ago. Their former leader passed away several years back, but his daughter, who inherited leadership of the pack, agreed to speak with me once I explained the true purpose of my inquiry." "What did she tell you?" Cade asked, leaning forward intently. "Everything," Corwin said. "Her father kept detailed records of every contract Ironclaw ever fulfilled, a habit she continued after inheriting leadership. This journal contains the original contract for Silvermoon's destruction, complete with Alaric Thornwood's personal seal and signature, along with payment records matching exactly the treasury shortfall Thornwood experienced 20 years ago." Cade's hands trembled slightly as he opened the journal, scanning the damning pages within. Lyra watched his expression shift from grim determination to something colder, harder, as the full weight of definitive proof settled before him. "This is unmistakable," he said finally, closing the journal carefully. "We finally have what we need to bring formal charges before the full council." But even as relief began to settle over the room, Corwin's expression remained troubled. "My lord, there is one more matter. The Ironclaw leader mentioned that word of our investigation has already reached certain ears. She believes someone within Thornwood's own network learned of my inquiries and reported back before I could return here safely." Cade's jaw tightened. "Alaric knows we are close to exposing him." "It seems likely," Corwin confirmed grimly, "which means he will not simply wait quietly for formal charges to be brought against him. A wolf capable of orchestrating an entire bloodline's destruction to expand his territory will not hesitate to eliminate any remaining threat to his position, especially now that threat has a name and a face known throughout the 12 packs." Lyra felt a chill settle over her despite the study's warm candlelight. "You believe he will come after me directly?" "I believe we must prepare for that possibility immediately," Cade said, already moving toward the study door to summon additional guards. "Corwin, double the watch around the fortress perimeter tonight. I want eyes on every approach, no exceptions." The following days passed in tense, watchful silence, the fortress operating under heightened security, while Cade quietly gathered support among trusted council allies, preparing to present the damning evidence at the next full assembly. Lyra found herself confined largely to the castle's interior, Cade's protective instincts sharpening with each passing hour as the formal council meeting approached. It happened on the fourth night, during the quiet hours before dawn, when the fortress guard traditionally changed shifts. Lyra woke suddenly to the sound of raised voices and clashing steel echoing through the corridors outside her chamber, her heart lurching with immediate, instinctive fear. She had barely risen from her bed when her door burst open, revealing not Cade or any of his trusted guards, but a stranger in dark leather armor, a curved blade already drawn. She screamed, stumbling backward, but the intruder advanced quickly, clearly under strict orders to eliminate his target before reinforcements could arrive. Lyra's mind raced desperately, years of instinctive survival kicking in, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her entirely. She grabbed the heavy candlestick from her bedside table, swinging it with all the strength she possessed, just as the intruder lunged forward. The blow caught him across the temple, staggering him just long enough for the chamber door to burst open again, this time revealing Cade himself, his eyes blazing with fury as he took in the scene before him. He crossed the room in an instant, subduing the intruder with brutal efficiency, before the man could recover his footing, pinning him against the stone wall with enough force to make the entire room shudder. "Who sent you?" Cade demanded, his voice carrying a dangerous, guttural edge Lyra had never heard from him before. The intruder said nothing, his eyes wild with fear even as he refused to speak, until Corwin arrived moments later with additional guards, quickly securing the prisoner for formal questioning. Lyra stood trembling in the corner of her chamber, the heavy candlestick still clutched in her white-knuckled grip, her entire body shaking with the aftershock of adrenaline and terror. Cade turned to her immediately, his fury melting instantly into fierce, protective concern. "Are you harmed?" "I am unharmed," Lyra managed, though her voice shook considerably. "He came so quickly, I barely had time to react." Cade crossed the room and gathered her carefully into his arms, a gesture that would have seemed impossibly forward under any other circumstance. yet felt entirely natural in the terrifying aftermath of what had just occurred. Lyra allowed herself to lean into his solid warmth, grateful beyond words for his sudden, timely arrival. "I should never have allowed you to remain unguarded, even for a single moment," Cade murmured against her hair, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. "This is my failure, Lyra. I promise you. It will not happen again." "You saved me," Lyra whispered. "That is what matters." They remained like that for a long moment, the chaos of the assassination attempt slowly settling into quiet aftermath around them, before Cade finally pulled back enough to meet her eyes directly, his expression carrying an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I have known for some time now that my feelings toward you extend far beyond simple duty or protection," he said quietly, his voice carrying unusual vulnerability for a man normally so composed and commanding. "Tonight, watching that blade come so close to ending your life, I understood with terrible clarity exactly how much losing you would devastate me." Lyra's heart pounded for entirely different reasons now, warmth spreading through her chest despite the lingering fear from moments before. "Cade, you do not need to answer tonight," he said gently, pressing a soft kiss against her forehead before she could finish speaking. "There will be time enough for such conversations once you are safe, once justice has finally been served for everything you have suffered. Tonight, simply know that you are not alone, and that I intend to ensure you never face danger like this again." The captured intruder, once properly questioned under Corwin's careful supervision, confirmed exactly what they had feared. Alaric Thornwood, learning of the damning evidence gathered against him, had ordered Lyra's immediate elimination in a desperate attempt to silence the one witness capable of confirming his guilt before the full council. The confession, combined with the mercenary pack's journal and the extensive trade records already gathered, provided more than enough evidence to bring formal charges before the entire Alpha Council without further delay. As dawn broke over Cade's fortress, painting the sky in soft gold and rose, Lyra stood at her chamber window, finally allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection amid the chaos of the past weeks. She had survived a genocide as an infant, endured 18 years of cruelty as an unwanted orphan, discovered an entire royal heritage in the span of a single evening, and now survived an assassination attempt meant to silence her forever. Whatever came next, whatever justice the council ultimately decided upon, Lyra understood with quiet, unshakable certainty that she was no longer simply surviving. For the first time in her entire life, she was finally, truly living, and she intended to face whatever remained of this fight with the same fierce resolve that had carried her this far already. The full Alpha Council convened 1 week later within the Great Assembly Hall of the Central Territory, a neutral ground where representatives from all 12 packs gathered only for matters of the gravest importance. Lyra stood beside Cade at the edge of the chamber, watching as pack leaders from across the land filed into their designated seats, murmurs of anticipation rippling through the assembly at the unusual nature of this emergency gathering. Alaric Thornwood arrived last, exactly as protocol dictated for a sitting council member of his standing, his composed expression giving no indication of the storm about to break over his carefully constructed life. He was a tall, silver-haired wolf with sharp, calculating eyes, exuding the kind of measured confidence that had clearly served him well through decades of careful political maneuvering. "Alpha King Cade," he said smoothly, taking his designated seat among the council members. "I confess curiosity regarding the nature of this emergency assembly. Your message provided little detail, beyond requesting the presence of every council member without exception. All will become clear shortly," Cade said evenly, stepping forward to address the full assembly. 20 years ago, the Silver Moon Pack was destroyed in a single devastating night, an entire royal bloodline believed eliminated entirely, their territory and resources subsequently absorbed by surrounding packs in the years that followed. A murmur passed through the assembled council members, several exchanging confused glances, uncertain why such ancient history warranted an emergency gathering after so many years. 3 weeks ago, Cade continued, I discovered that the last surviving heir of that bloodline did not in fact perish that night. She survived, hidden and unknowing of her own heritage for 18 years, until circumstances finally revealed the truth. He gestured toward Lyra, who stepped forward despite the nervous flutter in her chest, standing tall before the assembled leaders of every pack in the 12 territories. Recognition rippled through several faces already familiar with the events at Blackthorn's summit feast weeks prior, while others who had not yet heard the story stared in open astonishment. This confirmation alone would warrant serious discussion, Cade continued. But my investigation into Silvermoon's destruction uncovered something far more troubling than a simple tragic massacre. Evidence I have gathered, evidence I will now present before this full council, demonstrates conclusively that Silvermoon's destruction was neither random nor the work of an unnamed rival, but rather a deliberate, calculated act orchestrated for personal territorial gain. Alaric's composed expression flickered, just slightly, though he quickly smoothed it back into practiced neutrality. Such a serious accusation demands substantial proof, Alpha King. Indeed it does, Cade agreed, nodding to Corwin, who stepped forward carrying the recovered documents and the mercenary pack's damning journal. Which is precisely why I have gathered exactly that. Over the following hour, Cade methodically laid out the entire case before the stunned assembly, presenting the trade records showing Thornwood's suspicious territorial acquisitions, the testimony from the elderly former guard regarding rumors of a hired mercenary pack, and finally, the devastating journal entry bearing Alaric Thornwood's own personal seal and signature, contracting Ironclaw pack, for what was explicitly described as the elimination of the entire Silvermoon bloodline. The chamber erupted into chaos as the full weight of the evidence settled over the assembly. Several council members rose from their seats, shouting demands for immediate explanation, while others sat frozen in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend that a trusted fellow Alpha had orchestrated genocide simply to expand his own territory and wealth. Alaric's carefully composed mask finally cracked entirely as accusations mounted around him, his face contorting with fury and desperation in equal measure. "These documents prove nothing," he snarled, rising from his seat. "Forgeries, easily fabricated by anyone seeking to discredit a sitting council member. The mercenary pack's current leader has agreed to testify formally before this council regarding the contract's authenticity," Cade said coldly, unmoved by Alaric's protests, along with the guard who witnessed the payment arrangements firsthand. "And should further proof be required, I would remind this council that Alaric personally ordered an assassination attempt against Lyra Ashworth only 1 week ago, attempting to silence the sole witness capable of confirming his guilt before evidence could be presented formally." Gasps echoed through the chamber at this final revelation. Even Alaric's staunchest allies among the council exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of attempted assassination against a confirmed royal heir proving far too damning to defend against, regardless of political loyalty. "This is madness," Alaric spat, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence entirely, cracking under the mounting pressure of overwhelming evidence and universal condemnation now radiating from every corner of the assembly. "I built Thornwood's prosperity through decades of careful leadership, not through some fabricated conspiracy." "Enough," came a firm voice from among the elder council members, a respected Alpha named Godric, who had served on the council longer than almost anyone present. "The evidence presented here today is overwhelming, Alaric. Whatever prosperity you built for Thornwood was constructed upon the graves of an entire innocent bloodline. I call for immediate formal judgment." The council's vote, when finally called, proved nearly unanimous. Alaric Thornwood was stripped immediately of his Alpha status and council seat, his pack placed under emergency oversight, while a proper investigation determined the full extent of his crimes and appropriate restitution owed to the Silvermoon legacy. He was led from the chamber in restraints, his protests growing increasingly desperate and incoherent as guards escorted him toward formal detention, the weight of 20 years of carefully hidden guilt finally crashing down around him in a single devastating afternoon. As the chamber slowly emptied following the historic judgment, Lyra found herself surrounded by council members, offering formal apologies and condolences, many expressing genuine shame at how long Silvermoon's destruction had gone unquestioned and unpunished. She accepted their words graciously, though her heart still ached with the enormity of everything the day had finally confirmed. Cade found her standing alone near the tall windows of the now empty assembly hall, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard below. "It is finished," he said quietly, joining her at the window. "Justice has finally been served, 20 years overdue. It does not undo what was lost," Lyra said softly, though there was a quiet peace in her voice that had not existed there before. My parents will not return. The wolves of Silvermoon who died that night will not be restored to life. But at least now, their deaths mean something. At least now, the truth is finally known. The council has also formally recognized your claim as the last heir of Silvermoon, Cade said. Which means, should you choose to accept it, you have the right to rebuild your family's territory and legacy, with full support and protection from every pack among the 12 territories. Lyra turned to face him fully, considering his words carefully. That is an enormous undertaking. It is, Cade agreed. Which is precisely why I would not wish you to face it alone. He reached for her hand gently, and Lyra allowed him to take it, feeling the same warmth she had felt weeks ago in Blackthorn's garden, when he had first looked at her as though she were something precious rather than something worthless. I meant what I said to you that night after the assassination attempt, Cade continued, his voice carrying quiet, genuine sincerity. My feelings toward you extend far beyond duty or simple protection. I would be honored, Lyra of Silvermoon, if you would consider standing beside me, not merely as an ally in rebuilding your family's legacy, but as my equal, my partner, and if you are willing, eventually my queen. Lyra felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, though they carried none of the sorrow that had defined so much of her life until this moment. 18 years ago, this pack called me worthless, she said softly. They told me I was a burden, a curse, a nameless nothing unworthy of even basic kindness. Now the Alpha King of the 12 packs stands before me, asking me to be his queen. You were never worthless, Cade said firmly, lifting her chin gently to meet his eyes directly. You were always exactly who you are now, Lyra. Royal blood, fierce heart, remarkable strength. The world simply took far too long to recognize what was in front of them all along. Lyra smiled then, genuine and unguarded, the expression transforming her entire face with a warmth that had been buried beneath years of cruelty and dismissal. Then yes, she said, her voice steady and certain. I will stand beside you, Cade Direwolf, not as someone rescued, but as your equal. Outside the tall windows of the assembly hall, the sun continued its slow descent toward evening, casting golden light across a land that had finally, after 20 long years, begun setting right an ancient and terrible wrong. The pack that had once called her worthless now knew the truth of the royal blood running through her veins, and Lyra Ashworth, last heir of Silvermoon, stood ready at last to claim the future that had always, rightfully, belonged to her.